Nebraska Extension Policy Specialist Brad Lubben says there are several farm policy issues those in the industry should be aware of as we head into 2018. In Nebraska, property tax reform has been a significant focus for state senators and the state's governor. On the national level, trade discussions related to the North American Free Trade Agreement continue. Genetically modified food labeling could garner more attention with the rise of gene editing, and legislators will also hope to move a farm bill next year. We talked about these areas with Brad Tuesday morning, starting with a look at the progress for a new farm bill.
You know, fundamentally, we do expect a farm bill debate to get started in earnest in committee and then moving on past the committee to the floor sometime in early 2018. Both chairs have talked about getting ready, getting essentially legislation in place and to propose and move forward. For all the discussion about the potential reforms to the commodity title, the ARC equations and the ARC versus PLC decision, it's still fundamentally a broader debate about the budget and some major challenges like funding proposed changes to cotton programs or dairy programs, or even the livestock industry's ask for a vaccine bank. All of those that take new money that you have to wonder where the budget's going to come from to pay for such things.
Any major changes as it would relate to Nebraska farmers that you see right now?
The fundamental discussion over ARC and PLC may leave that program largely intact as it is, with some modifications to the ARC formula, for example. But the biggest implication for Nebraska producers, and all producers frankly, may be that we expect a new decision on ARC versus PLC for the producer to make in 2019. And that new decision could be very, very different than what they had a decision back on in 2014.
Let's move on to trade. How real do you think the threat is that the U.S. walks away from NAFTA?
You know, the best prognostication seems to be that this is the hardest, most threatening negotiating strategy you can come up with, to promise to walk away if we can't get this resolved, but yet everyone thinks that somehow we've got to get to the finish line and get it resolved and renegotiate it as opposed to walk away from it. All the analysis points to the importance of trade, the integration of the North American continent here in terms of a trading sector, and so it's difficult to imagine walking away, and yet that seems to be the threat, at least to push forward a tougher negotiating strategy.
One other federal issue before we move on to the state level here in Nebraska. The update on food labeling is what?
Well, food labeling is that interesting issue, and we may always be dealing with this issue. But when Congress passed legislation to effectively preempt a myriad set of state-by-state labeling rules, that federal legislation required disclosure of GM technology or GM processes in food products. But USDA has to come up with the definition of what specifically is covered and how it's disclosed. And you're stuck with a debate over, well, when is a GM product labeled and when is it not? Is it the kind of product where the trait is still in the food product, or is it the kind of byproduct of like soybean oil that doesn't contain genes? Is that still a labeled component or not? And then even more complicated, the new technology of CRISPR and gene editing, that's not technically gene transfer, so is that covered under the same definition as our first generation GM technology? There's a lot of questions here yet unanswered and a lot of debate yet to happen.
On the state level for Nebraska, perhaps the most apparent question is, what's the reality of property tax reform in 2018?
Right. You know, property tax reform has been a priority and it continues to be, by all accounts, the top priority of almost every tax-paying interest group out there. And yet we're also dealing with a budget crunch and underperforming state revenues, at least underperforming relative to forecasts. And so finding funding to make any sort of tax relief, or finding funding to deal with school finance, which by all accounts has to be a fundamental component of any tax proposal. Those are difficult propositions to finish, but one expects to see more debate in the legislature this coming year over further tax reform.
If it's not done in the legislature, will it be done via referendum?
We hear that, and it's quite possible to imagine a referendum process a petition going forward at the same time that we introduce legislation and have a debate in the legislature, and we may deal with it one way or the other. Either way will require some rather difficult choices on other taxes as well as spending in the coming year and years.